Okay, so we left off talking about Mies and especially about what's known as the Second Chicago School. So just as a reminder, we talked about the first Chicago school in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and how influential that was on the development, especially the development of the skyscraper, um, and creating not just the physical development of it, structural and technologies to make tall buildings, but also the architectural development of it, how a skyscraper should look. So that more or less gets resolved with the Chicago School, but then in the post-war period, especially with the arrival of Mies van der Rohe at IIT and the work he began doing based out of his office in Chicago, we really start to see um, a second sort of generation of architects designing mostly skyscrapers. I mean, obviously, they worked on other types of buildings as well, but really especially giving a post-World War II form to the skyscraper. And even the idea that Mies had in the 1920s of really an all-glass facade, which wasn't possible back in the late 19th, early 20th century, but by the 1950s and 60s, it definitely is possible. So here he is. We left off here. He was talking to students at IIT, and a lot of these students would go on to stay in Chicago and work for some of the other firms that I will mention as we go. But including sometimes for Mies in his office. So I'm going to highlight a few projects that he's most famous for in this phase of his career. The first one, not a high-rise at all, just a small, not even a house really. It's residential, but this was like a weekend house or a summer house for Edith Farnsworth, the client, who was a wealthy doctor in Chicago, and met Mies and happened to tell him that she had some land out in way west, not even west suburban, but especially at that time, just a little town out west of Chicago, west of Aurora, and that she wanted to have a little house on it that she could retreat to on the weekends. And so he said, I can build you that house, and so started a relationship that results in the Farnsworth House in 1952. And the story goes that there might have been more than just a professional relationship as well, but I'll leave that for another time. All right, so here is the image. I'm sure you've all seen at least the images. This was saved through huge fundraising preservation effort about 15 years ago, that this was threatened with somebody buying it at an auction and then just moving it, maybe even out of the country. Some wealthy Arab, oil baron, Arab sheik or something might have bought it and moved it to Dubai or something like that. So it was quite a success to keep this here on its site in Illinois, even though it floods on a regular basis. So anyway, I encourage you to go out and see this sometime. It's a great little summer trip. It's just an hour and a half or so outside from, if traffic's not too bad, out west of Aurora. So this represents Mies' philosophy in the post-war period. It's all steel and glass. It is small and intimate. It's like I say, just a weekend house, so there's not a lot to it, but it is really represents the philosophy that you've probably heard described to Mies: less is more. Or even more frankly, that's really famous, but more relevant quote that he had is almost nothing, creating an architecture that is, quote, almost nothing, stripping down everything that is inessential to a building and leaving only those things that are required: the structure, the facade, the mechanical systems. And this, when you have a little weekend house and it doesn't require too much anyway, you can really create a house that is truly almost nothing. The other thing he does do, I reference the fact that it floods because it sits along a riverside on the Fox River, I believe it is. And, they expected it to flood, so he raised it up on these pilotis, it's borrowing from one of Corbu's 5 points. But unfortunately, the flooding's gotten worse with climate change in the last few decades, and this will often flood way above the floor line here, and on occasion has broken through the glass and caused significant amount of damage. So there's been talk about trying to raise it or move it on the site, but I'm not sure that'll ever happen. So here's a couple more views of it. It has a flat podium that just allows, a pure balcony. When we talked about Crown Hall at IIT, we saw a similar sort of porch or podium, and I talked about the fact that he didn't even want handrails on that. Well, a rural house, 1.5 foot off the ground, she didn't even need handrails here, so he was able to even strip that away here. Here's a nice view. Here you can see a little bit of the porch podium, and you can see how it sits up on pilotis, how it cantilevers out, and that mirrors the construction of the main house itself. You can see through the windows to see some of the furniture that he had Mrs. Farnsworth or Ms. Farnsworth. The story is she became not too fond of the house for a variety of reasons. One is that it took a lot longer to build than she expected. It cost a lot more than she expected, and she was, she knew what she was getting into, as a later court hearing would reveal. But it's a glass house, so it's a very rural site. Architectural gawkers, still came along, and yes, there's curtains, but if you draw the curtains, what's the point of having a glass house in this bucolic riverside setting? And so she felt like she didn't have very much privacy here, which is somewhat understandable, especially when the county moved the highway nearby. They moved it closer, they rerouted it, built a new bridge over the river, and it came pretty close to her house. So even driving by, you could sort of sneak a peek, so to speak, of the house and whoever's inside, I guess. So here's another view of it. Here you can clearly see it's sitting up on the pilotis. This is definitely similar to Corbu's 5 points. There's no roof deck, the way we saw in some of his earlier examples by Corbu, but one of the floor slabs become a roof deck. This is almost the domino house that I showed you, if you're remembering that, and you should, where it was just some columns, floor slabs, and that's it, and that represented Corbu's ideas of the 5 points. Well, here it is constructed essentially by Mies, with just a little bit of glazing to enclose it. So here's another view. These are all the photos I've taken on my last trip out there. All right, so back to high rises. Probably one of his most famous and a very early one is 880 Lakeshore Drive here in Chicago. This was designed 1949, finished in 51, and then there's two more, the 900 and I don't know, 900 and 9 something right across the street, which came a little later and have a little different detailing. But so these are two residential, co-op apartment towers. And this is really significant in a number of ways. First of all, this is one of the first times he gets to do a skyscraper. It's not the very first. There's a couple others here in Chicago that are earlier, but because of steel shortages from World War II, those earlier ones are actually built out of concrete. This is the first time he's able to build a steel and glass skyscraper, which is what he really wanted to do. He wanted to work in steel mostly, unlike Corbu, who liked to work in concrete more. And so we're really beginning to see here a true philosophy of what a mid or late 20th century skyscraper ought to look like. And of course, these are even taller than the first Chicago school skyscrapers that topped out at about 15 to 20 stories tall. And one of the things that's really significant, right on Lakeshore Drive, so obviously there's incredible lake vistas if you happen to have a view on the east. Well, By building two buildings and setting them sort of perpendicular to each other on this oddly shaped site, he actually maximizes those units that have a lake view. So you've got, you know, a wide elevation on the right here that, you know, provides direct lake views, and you got the narrow elevation of this building that provides lake views. But pretty much anyone in this side here on the north side of the south building also has a lake view. And the same will be true for if you are on the north elevation of this wing, and even some on the south elevation there. So it really helps to maximize those lake views, which makes a more valuable apartment or co-op condo or whatever. So you know, value of the building, and the developer who's building this wants, you know, to maximize the value. So this is a way to do that without crowding the site, you know, without, you know, creating a building that takes up the entire site. It also creates a nice landscape and gardens around the base of the building, which are raised up on pilotis so that one really has an openness when you're down on the ground. Here's a nice historic view with the old cars that I happen to like. This is from the west looking out towards the lake. So here you see the sides of the building that don't have quite as nice a view unless you like looking at the city, I guess. So these would have been, you know, radical modern buildings in 1950. You know, and this would have been really a representation of what the future of architecture is going to hold. Here's a site plan, and again, you can see that sort of angled edge here at Lakeshore Drive and the way the two buildings relate to one another, which is very similar to the way he planned the buildings at the IIT campus, where they're not just lined up, squared off, you know, they sort of sit where there's space that flows in and around and in between. And he, you know, we saw that even with the Barcelona Pavilion in an earlier lecture, the way he designed the interior spaces at the Barcelona Pavilion. Here's just a cool view photo I took standing between the buildings, looking straight up. And so this, like the Farnsworth House, is stripped down, at least the exteriors are stripped down to almost nothing. You have steel I-section columns, or technically a W-section, some people call them I-beams, columns that provide, you know, framing for the exterior. You've got a steel drill in between, and then you got a big giant window. And if you've got a great skyscraper view of the lake, you want a big giant window. And you know, I guess in some ways the people in these units don't have much privacy like Mrs. Farnsworth, but you know, you got to draw your shades, I suppose, in this case. So here's a view at the ground showing the lobby. So, you know, the entire building is set up on these pilotis. You can see the big thick columns, and then just a portion of that is enclosed as a lobby space, and, you know, the elevator core and, you know, exit stair cores are in that, but the rest of the space is left open with just this beautiful travertine paving. There's another view looking at the other building, and he puts a little roof over the connection between the buildings so that if you're walking between buildings, you've got a little covering or protection. I think there may be an underground connector as well, but this is, you know, just really architecture at its most basic form and simplicity. Nothing else extra is added to these building exteriors that isn't needed. And I like this photo as a favorite. Here he is. He's already a pretty elderly gentleman by the time these were designed. Here he is standing with a view to 860-880. And the story is, somebody asked him once, you know, oh, you know, Mies, how come you didn't live in your great, you know, creation at 860-880 Lakeshore Drive? And he, you know, he always had this thick German accent. He says, well, I did not want to ride the elevator with other residents complaining about their apartments. So that was his excuse, I suppose. He actually ironically lived in a vintage condo in Streeterville on Ohio Street and there's photos of him, you know, sitting in these very modern, you know, Mies designed chairs with all this crown molding and dado molding on the walls and stuff. So it's kind of ironic that he designed these super modern, no ornament buildings, and he lived in a, richly decorated condo. So perhaps his most famous commercial building and one of the earliest, taking the principles of 860, 880 and applying them, is the Seagram Building in New York City from 1958. So here's a historic view of that, which is the best way to look at this in many ways now, because this building, it has this basic exterior principles of design and construction that we saw at 860, 880, so I won't really cover that over too much. But this had another really groundbreaking approach to skyscraper. If we talk about the Art Deco towers of the 1920s and how they stepped back. One of the reasons for doing that, those step backs, was for zoning laws, and cities were really nervous about these tall buildings creating dark canyons in the city streets down below, where light would not easily filter down. And so they required, the taller the building got, the more it had to step back away from the property line. And so these 1920s tall towers generally have these step backs. So Mies came up with an approach and approached the city at the time and said, well, what if instead of having my buildings step back, which he didn't want to do, it would break up the pure geometry and form of his tower. He said, what if I just step the whole building back and I create a giant plaza out front so that then you get the sun angle down to I believe this is Park Avenue and I set the building way on the back end of the site. And the city said, oh, okay, sure. And Mies said, well, and the advantage too is you get this wonderful open plaza that could be a sort of like a public plaza, and it will relieve the monotony of the buildings lining the sidewalk. And so it sounded like a great idea at the time, and this historic view shows exactly what he was thinking. You can see how how the neighboring buildings are right up on the sidewalk. They're not as tall. You can see how this one steps back as it gets taller, and his building steps even further back and then goes just straight up like a monolithic slab. And the problem, great idea, except the problem is every other developer said, oh, I'll do that too. And so now all the buildings are stepped back and they're all super tall and straight and plain. And so in a way, and they all have these big open plazas, which tend to be very windswept. As wind hits these tall buildings, it swoops down and it creates a very windy plaza. Nobody wants to sit in them. And many of them are just blank open spaces with nothing in them. And so in many ways it caused a breakdown of the urban character of big cities like New York, and even somewhat less in Chicago, which was later to adapt that. But here's a more modern view. I took this, and you can see a neighboring building does in fact go right up to the street line, so you can get a little sense of how it's still stepped back here, even though many of the other buildings in New York now have these big setbacks with plazas. So here's that plaza. It's very beautiful, but as you can see, really, there's nothing in it other than these fountains. There's no place to sit. There's no benches, there's no park, there's no trees, or very few usually, and so they tend to be kind of empty, barren spaces. And it's one of the arguments that comes out of by the late 60s and well into the 70s. And so people, urban planners and so forth are like, these plazas are horrible because they're just empty and they just suck away life on city streets. So here's a nice view. Again, we see the straight, vertical, uninterrupted columns between each window. This goes right to Louis Sullivan's, a tall building should be tall, it should be lofty, it should be vertical, emphasize the verticality of that. And Mies is able to do that, uninterrupted with these columns going straight up. And even the proportions, the windows themselves have a vertical proportion that reinforces the verticality of this building. So there's a similar example here in Chicago. That's the Federal Center from 1964, not finished. It was built in stages, not finished until 1974, even after Mies's death. And we see basically the same kind of architecture. He figured it out and then he stuck with it, you know. And so the sets up on pilotis. You have the uninterrupted vertical mullions between windows and all that. So we see the post office on the right. That's a low-rise building. We've got the Dirksen building, the Dirksen courthouse, I'm sorry, is on the left, and then the Klozinski office building is the taller one in the center here. And from a planning standpoint, as you can kind of see in this image, he's doing the same thing he did at 860-880, and the same thing he did at Barcelona Pavilion, the same thing he did at IIT, where he's not just creating buildings right up on the street line, all in line with each other. He creates a plaza by having buildings of different heights, of different shapes, and different locations that allow you to move in and around the buildings on the site here. And then later, in the early 70s, Alexander Calder's Flamingo is added into this, which is, I think, one of the most perfect urban sculptures for its site ever created. It's steel, and it's in this plaza of a steel and glass building, and it's a really elegant, beautiful piece of sculpture by Calder. Here's a historic view of the Dirksen courthouse itself, and again, you just see how modern this building is compared at that time to the Loop, the architecture in the Loop, which were of both Art Deco, classical revival, and Chicago school buildings. This really stood out. Now you go in the Loop and you see almost all the buildings look like this, but this kind of architecture was radical at the time because nobody had built like this before. So it was really groundbreaking. Here's a nice view showing the low-rise post office building in the foreground, and you can see how the Dirksen courthouse is tall, but not super tall, and then the Klozinski office building is much taller. It rises, and it creates and you see this plaza or this complex from different angles. You get a nice complexity of this, and it's a great urban planning accomplishment, not just a great work of architecture. Here's again the buildings rest up on pilotis. So here we see the glazed lobby walls and then the solid granite walls of the elevator cores. Here's just a view of a courthouse. I actually did the National Register nomination for the complex, so I got to go into a courtroom without having to be a defendant. So that's the best way to see that. All right, and then last view of the Mies building. There's a video link that I'll wait till the end of this little sub-lecture here, and then when we take a short break, we'll watch this fun little Mies video here in a few minutes. All right, so a couple of the other firms that really emerge out of this second Chicago school, one probably the most famous and the most successful is SOM, or Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. The firm had actually existed previous. I think that it was founded in the 1930s, and they were doing more traditional architecture of that era. But in this post-war period, they fully embraced the Miesian aesthetic. And some of the design, the head designers at the firm, because Skidmore, Owings and Merrill by this time, are retired or nearly retired, and so it's these younger designers that start in the 1950s that really create, put this firm on the map and create some of the most famous of the second Chicago buildings. And one of those is Gordon Bunshaft, and he was a lead partner. He fully embraced this Miesian aesthetic and was working out of the Chicago office. SOM was based in Chicago, but they were such a big firm, still are, that they had offices, in major cities. So in the Chicago or in the New York office, Gordon Bunshaft was kind of the lead designer in this area. And one of the first buildings to embrace these technologies and this design aesthetic is Lever House from 1950 to 52. And here we see a historic view of it. Again, love the old cars. And this building sort of takes the same philosophy that Seagram Building does, which is, what if we set it back, create a tall, plain slab, monolithic slab, but we push it back on its site. It takes a little different view in that it has a low-rise building at the base that the tower rises out of. And that low-rise building actually has an inner courtyard as well. It's kind of a fascinating building, actually. But you can see, both in that historic view and this more contemporary view that I took, that it has the same design principles that Mies was working with. The uninterrupted mullions between windows, everything else pretty much is glass, an emphasis on the verticality and stripping away anything that isn't essential to the building so that it's almost nothing. This is kind of an interesting one in that it has a kind of a blue or greenish tinted glass to it, or almost a blue-green turquoise-like tint to the glass. But here you can see the base of the building, which in itself is more successful because it's got roof gardens, just like the Corbu principle of having roof gardens. It is set up on pilotis, as you'll see in a minute. So this is a nice combination between Corbu's 5 points and Miesian philosophies. So here's the vista as you're walking along Park Avenue. This is kitty corner to the Seagram Building. I was standing in the plaza of Seagram in that last photo. So as you come along, you see this low-rise building here and the pilotis, but you see greenery too. And I think this is much more successful. I think I got another view of here's that inner courtyard. So you walk through the pilotis into this nice courtyard space. And to me, this was much more successful. It's got plantings, it's got places to sit, it's got little outdoor cafe areas. You see trees when you look up and around. This is a much more pleasant space than the windswept Seagram Plaza and others like it. Here's a view underneath the low-rise wing, so it's protected. If it's raining out, you can still come out and have your lunch or take a smoke break or whatever people do to get outside, and and you're protected. So it really is more accepting of people and urban life than the Miesian approach was, actually. And here's just a nice view of the tower facade. Again, you can see the uninterrupted window mullions and the sort of turquoise color glazing. Another SOM principal was Bruce Graham, and he was originally from Colombia, came to the US in the 1940s and joined SOM in 1951, and he also fully embraced this Miesian aesthetic as well, and did some of the most famous of SOM's commission. He was based in the Chicago office, and the example here is the Inland Steel Building from 1958. And this is another great historic view with the old cars, and I like, compare that to the Majestic Building directly next to it. What a comparison this would have been in the time. Even today, this looks striking because of its stainless steel facade. It shimmers in sunlight when the sunlight is hitting it. And in the era when it was first built, this would have been, really groundbreaking to people to see how radical and how different and new this was. And this is one of the reasons why people really began to embrace this modern architecture, because to them it looked new, it looked forward, and we've come to better embrace historic preservation now, as we'll talk about in a couple of lectures. But at this time, people, like I say, in that post-war period, they wanted something new, they wanted something different, they wanted to forget the darker past of the Depression and of world wars and so forth. Here's how it looks today. More more buildings around it. The Majestic building is still there. You can't quite see it on the. It's hidden behind this more modern building, but it's still a striking building. It sets up on pilotis for the most part. One of the things that's unique about it, and you can see it better in this view, is that he actually creates a separate element that is the core for the building. So the elevators and stair and the office lobbies are all in this solid core off to the back. And what that does is it allows for the floor plates to be open. I think I have, well, here you can see, let me go, yeah. So here's the floor plan of it. Here is that office core off to the side, or off, really actually off the back. But then the rest of the building can be completely open. This is one of the first buildings to have a full open office plan. And you don't even, usually in these skyscrapers, you've got a core right in the center where you got the restrooms and the, stairs and the elevators. Because all of that is off to the side, this allows this whole floor plate to be completely open, fully embracing that idea of Mies for the universal space, that completely flexible, open space, uninterrupted, just like we saw at Crown Hall. And you can do that in this building because of this extra wing over here. And the other thing you can do, and you can see them on the plans, these little bump outs here, is so that he doesn't have columns. He does the same thing that Mies does at Crown Hall, where he creates essentially giant girders that span this space so that there's no interior columns. And they express, Graham expresses them on the exterior with these, thick columns that come out. You don't see the beams that go across, and the building's too tall to see the giant girders on top, like the way you can at Crown Hall, but it's all expressed. It's all there, just the way, again, going back to Sullivan's form follows function philosophy. And here's a historic view of one of those office spaces in which you can see, completely wide open. I mean, in fact, this is a great trend, or at least before the pandemic it was, of interior office, commercial office space, was to have these sort of benched seatings, no cubicles, no private offices, just all open space that we see here. So, things come around full circle again, and we'll see what happens now in the post-pandemic era. Another great example came out of the Chicago office, and Bruce Graham as designer, is the Sears Tower from 1973. And I want to introduce the engineer for that, who is Fazlur Khan. Khan was born in Bangladesh and came to the US to study engineering at the University of Illinois down in Urbana, joined SOM in 1955, and was probably the most brilliant structural engineer of the 20th century, and really is responsible for figuring out how to build what we call super tall skyscrapers. So, the great engineering of the first Chicago school figured out how to build, taller buildings on, swampy soil in Chicago and things like that. There were a lot of structural innovations in that era. Fazlur Khan is largely responsible for figuring out how to build, 80-story buildings, 100-story buildings, and more and more and more. The principles that he created for these buildings in the 1950s and 60s apply even today for the really tall buildings, mostly in Asia and the Middle East. So here is the Sears building. I refuse to call it by any other name. It's always the Sears building to me. And what is unique about this building is that you can see that it doesn't just go straight up as a big monolithic slab the way Seagram building does, say. This as it gets taller, it gets smaller. And it's not because of zoning issues like the step back towers of the Art Deco towers in the 1920s. This is a way to structurally make this building more stable as it gets taller. And Khan had the concept, I think in the next slide I might show it, or here's just another view of it. The concept came to Khan from a pack of cigarettes, right? If you see someone, try to, get a cigarette out of the package or whatever, they kind of tap it, and one or more cigarettes starts popping out, and they're, the one you grab is the one that came furthest out, but there's usually one or two or three others that start peeking out too. And he realized that this lower part here provides structural stability of the wind loads. And so, but as you get taller, you don't need that as much because if the building gets more narrow. So it's called a bundled tube concept. Here you can see it real nice and clear, in that you take a bunch of, these are almost, each bay here is almost like its own individual skyscraper. And down at the base where, the stresses are the greatest, it's a full, section thickness. But as it gets taller and taller, you drop away some of the sections, and you can get pretty tall then at the very top with that final section. So here's the cutaway. So you see down at the bottom at A, section A over here, it has all 9 sections. But as you get taller and taller, you start to drop away some of those sections until at the very tippy top, you just have 2 of the sections that are sticking all the way up and creating the tallest part of that. And this helps provide the structural stability to withstand the massive wind loads that these tall buildings have, especially in a windy city like Chicago. And so here's a great view of it during construction. Not even topped off yet. There's going to be a few more floors coming up at the top here, but you can see the structural grid of it, and you can see how these different bundles help provide wind stability, lateral stability, as you get down to the base where the loads are the greatest. So when it was completed in 1973, the Sears Tower was the tallest building in the world. It had surpassed, there were a couple others, for a long time the Empire State Building was, but some of the buildings, including the World Trade Center, the old World Trade Center in New York, for a brief moment was the tallest building. But Sears Tower went way above those. And it wasn't really until the 1990s, mid to late 1990s, that other countries started building buildings that were even taller. And we see a lot of them in the Middle East and in Asia. Ironically, in the Middle East, because they have plenty of land, this is probably more of a developer ego thing than anything. But certainly in Asia, there's a massive density, so it makes more sense there. Technically, the Sears building is no longer even the tallest building in America or in North America. That is the Council on Tall Buildings declares the stupid Freedom Tower in New York. I hate the building. I think it's ugly as sin. They consider that taller because the antenna, this is right here, the antenna on that one is taller. Actually, they're not even taller than the antennas on the Sears building, but because the antennas on the Sears building were afterthoughts, they didn't think that they are part of the architecture. But let me tell you this is my philosophy. If you stand on the top floor of the Sears building, you would look on the roof of the Freedom Tower in New York. If they were side by side, you would see the antenna sticking up, but you would be looking down on the roof. And in my opinion, what is a building? A building is a space that is inhabited. So to me, the Sears building is still the tallest building in North America, for what it's worth. All right, so another great project came out of Bruce Graham and Fazlur Khan team is the Hancock Building from 1969. And here, Khan has a different approach to the structure. Instead of the bundled tube, he uses diagonal bracing. And this was well known as a way to help resist those lateral wind loads. But what he does, or what Graham does with Khan, is say, hey, let's express that. Form follows function. We'll go with Louis Sullivan. We'll do the Miesian philosophy of expressing the true structure and nature of the building. And so let's expose those diagonal braces on it. They also taper the building, very unusual, especially at that time, so that it is a little narrower at the top. Again, At the base is where the greatest stress from the wind loads occurs, just like we saw with the Sears Tower. But instead of being blocky and chunky, this one gracefully tapers, and you can see how it tapers with the vertical columns expressed, and then on the edges it angles off at a distance there. So this makes a beautiful silhouette on the Chicago skyline, and it hasn't been completely crowded in by other skyscrapers, so you can still see the Hancock Building tapering really gracefully on the Chicago skyline. Here's a great view of that from a tall building or a drone or something like that. And a great view from the ground. It's a really cool building to look up at from the ground, because you see the drama of the tapered, and you see the drama of these giant steel X braces. All right, another firm that comes out of this Chicago and this generation, this Miesian philosophy, is C.F. Murphy and Associates, also made up of a lot of Mies proteges. And the main project I want to show you is the Richard J. Daley Center, not to be confused with the Richard M. Daley Center, his son, both of them mayors. This is from 1965, and Jacques Bronson was the primary designer for C.F. Murphy and Associates. So here we see kind of a blurry view here, unfortunately, but we see this building. This takes the Miesian approach that Seagram does. It's a tall monolithic slab. It sets up on one end of the site, and that allows for what is known as Daley Plaza. And of course, famous, perhaps more famous than the building, is the Picasso sculpture that's there. But it creates in this case, this is a plaza that I think is more successful, partly because of the Picasso. It's such a draw, and people love to climb on it, especially kids, right? And it becomes like the little front yard or whatever of Chicago. So a lot of activities happen on this plaza. Here's a great view of the building with the Picasso in front of it. This uses Corten steel as the exterior material, as does the Picasso. It's one of the probably competes with the Calder sculpture at Federal Plaza for being a perfect sculpture for its site, because this is made out of Corten steel as well. And you have the backdrop of the Corten steel behind it. And remember, we saw that first at the John Deere Center by Eero Saarinen, and it's that steel that is chemically made to have an oxidation on the surface, so it looks like it's rusted, but then that actually protects the rest of the steel itself without having to paint it or coat it in some other way. Here's a great view of the plaza and the Picasso, and contrast that with a very neoclassical courthouse in the background there. And this is also set up on pilotis, and it has a glazed lobby space. So it's really straight out of Mies's vocabulary, but it uses a couple of little different techniques like the Corten steel that Mies didn't tend to use. And lastly, out of their office is the McCormick Place, the original one from 1968. Gene Summers and Helmut Jahn. You've probably heard of Helmut Jahn, of course. Gene Summers was a protege of Mies that came out of IIT during Mies's tenure. And this is famous not as a high-rise, but as this massive exhibition hall with these huge trusses that overhang the building and provide a column-free interior, which is great for an exhibition hall where you want maximum flexibility to do any kind of exhibition and layout. Perfect example of a universal space that Mies had. And here you can see an aerial view of it. And all of this plane, other than the perimeter columns we just saw, is column free. So it's these massive trusses that really allow for that open space. And of course, you can see the Sears Tower in the background and all in the great city skyline beyond that. So really a great example of another principle of Mies used. Here you go, under construction. You can see the trusses, the just massive giant trusses, all supported by these perimeter columns, including the cantilever here. It's really an incredible feat of structural engineering. Okay, so that ends Miesian architecture and the Second Chicago School.